There he is. What's up, Chris? How you doing?
Hey, Pete, good to see you.
Likewise. So hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another Modern Sales Power Hour. I'm Pete Kazanjy. I'm your host. We're gonna give folks like a little bit of time to kind of trickle in here. Chris, while folks are kind of like getting situated, got any business travel coming up? Any non-business travel happening? What's
I,
shaking?
I'm pretty excited. I'm going to go to London for a conference in March.
Oh wow.
And that'll be my first international trip since I had my son. And
Oh.
but before the trip, I'm going to do the Alps for the weekend. So I'm
Ooh.
pretty excited about that.
Oh my goodness gracious, that sounds amazing.
Yeah,
Um,
won't be terrible.
yeah, it's a good problem to have. Um, so for me, I don't have I actually have any meaningful travel coming up, but I am my wife is doing a staycation here in San Francisco, so I've got a whole tricked out schedule for my 5-year-old and me. I'm going to take him to a pinball parlor.
Pinball.
A pinball
Wow.
parlor.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a pinball parlor in the Upper Haight that one of my colleagues hipped us to. It's called Free Gold Watch, and my 5-year-old's been obsessed with it all week long. So should be fun there. Awesome. Well,
Nice.
for folks, while folks are joining, while we're waiting, love to give everyone a take a few minutes to get familiar with Goldcast here. This event encourages audience participation. So, please do use the chat panel. You can leverage the Q&A. Chris and I are here to answer questions. There's a bunch of questions that were submitted ahead of time, which is great. But with that, let's go ahead and get started here. So for folks who aren't familiar, Power Hour is hosted by Modern Sales Pros. MSP is the world's largest revenue leadership community for those in sales management, sales and revenue operations, sales development, and the related disciplines. And so the community's mission is pretty straightforward. It's to create an environment for our 30,000 and growing members to answer questions that they'd struggle to solve on their own, help them see around corners they may not know about, just get better in general. And so the way that MSP does that is through great live sessions like what you're about to experience today, our robust online forum, and in-person events. And so for those who weren't previously admitted, you should now have access to the community. Before we get started, just a couple of reminders here. Power Hour is a unique format insofar as there's not a specific kind of piece of content we're talking through, rather than we're picking the brain of our illustrious revenue leadership guests that we have. So you're here to learn. Please do leverage the Q&A. Use the chat, etc. So with that, let's go ahead and head into some introductions here. I'll make mine super quick. So my name is Pete Kazanjy. I'm one of the founders of Atrium. We make data-driven sales management software that helps sales managers, leaders, and organizations manage better through metrics, right? Use data to improve team performance. And so what Atrium does is it continuously monitors dozens and dozens of AE and SDR KPIs and proactively alerts managers and leaders when something is off with their reps and their teams and so on. And so what this means is that managers can get to coaching insights faster and to drive positive behavior change and win. And so one of the cool things about Atrium is it takes about 2 minutes to set up through a read-only connection to your CRM, your Salesforce account. So that's a little bit on me and Atrium. Also wrote a book on startup sales called Founding Sales after I sold my last software company, Talent Bin, in 2014. So that's a little bit on me. But more importantly, we've got Chris here today, who currently leads revenue at Census. Chris, maybe you can kind of share a little bit about what you spend your time on at Census, a little bit about Census, and then maybe just kind of give folks some context around some of the sales motions you've worked on previously, just so they kind of understand like where you're coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for the intro. Chris Calkin, I'm VP of Revenue at Census. Census is the platform that gives you the ability to sync data from your warehouse into your business tools. So whether that's Snowflake, BigQuery, Redshift, whether that's HubSpot, Salesforce, Marketo, Mixpanel, you're going to be able to get your data from the warehouse to your business tools in an automated capacity. So what I'm doing here, I mean, honestly, I'm still learning. I'm here for 3 months. I'm obviously leading the revenue organization and really helping us establish what I'd call kind of the science and art behind the sale. For me, it's establishing the science to make sure we can measure everything so that we can focus on the art. The how do we get better at going from qualify to validate? How do we get better at going from negotiation to close one? And all of those factors. That's been a huge focus for me over the last 3 months, and then really enjoying getting to know the data space. Prior to the Census, I led revenue at a fintech called Moov Financial. It was a great experience. It's a Series A fintech, literally building from zero, right? We didn't have a client, we didn't have Salesforce, we didn't have operations. So that was a great experience for me to just get kind of bare bones sales leadership experience. And prior to that, I was at CircleCI. I had a team of about 75 sellers across San Francisco, Boston, London, Tokyo.
Wow.
And that was a very interesting motion in the sense that it was software for software developers. And obviously I'm not selling with software developers.
Nope.
And actually my IC experience, which was prior to CircleCI, I sold in MarTech. So worked in MarTech for about 5 years and actually know that space pretty well, which has actually paid off at Census as one of our core stakeholders as the marketer. So that's me.
For sure. Cool, man. Well, I think like one thing that I would love to kind of ask about is what are kind of the deltas between the sales motion, the CircleCI sales motion, where one of the cool things about developer tools is you have a situation where, and this is related to like product-led sales, or at least, a sales assist motions, where the person who has the pain point is also the person who has access to like production, like has the keys to the kingdom. Maybe not production, maybe staging, right?
Sure.
Like has the keys to the kingdom. But like essentially what you don't have is you don't have like a baton pass between someone who has the pain point and then has to go and then advocate to somebody, not just for a purchase, but maybe even just to like help them like see what's going on or like, pilot something. And I think and I'll just cop to it really quickly. Like I'm a huge Census fan. Like we've been a customer for like 3 years, I want to say. I'd have to ask Boris like what like customer instance number we are, but it's certainly under 100 and it's probably under like 50 and maybe even under 20. But the important thing there is that like usually the person who's like the buyer or the person who gets utility out of Census is not necessarily the person who can at least like deploy it initially.
Right.
Was that a big shift and I recognize that you've only been there for 3 months, is like how has your CircleCI experience played into that, or has it not? And it's just kind of like picking back up the marketing sales motion.
No, it's a big question, and I have got a lot of perspectives on it. First of all, it's one of the reasons I joined Census. Like one of the things I think that's challenging for a revenue leader selling a tool in DevOps is that ultimately that pain point is something that you personally don't experience, right? That is something that a software engineer experiences or the software group experiences. And ultimately you can kind of get up to speed on, but isn't something that like I personally had issues with, versus like the issue that Census solves. As a revenue leader, I very much so felt that pain, and that was great. So in that sense, it's really positive, right? It's a very technical solution. It has that intricacy and that detail, but it also has that business impact. But to your point, like the developer sale is nice in the sense that I can just sell to developers and to just go along that path, and that's where PLG can kind of work. So how that has helped me kind of in Census, first of all, you cannot ignore the engineering group. Like that fundamentally is just do that at your peril. And so if you're going to think about that persona as one of your buyers, you need to establish a journey that's really heavy on documentation, really heavy on videos, really heavy on thought leadership. If everything that you do is gated behind a sales wall, you're going to alienate that buyer somewhat. And the reality is, for an earlier stage company, if they're kind of looking to self-serve, that's often with a more technical buyer. And so we very much so care about that user and care about that buyer and want to cater to them accordingly. And so we establish that type of motion. That said, the business pain is felt by the heads of marketing, heads of sales, et cetera. So how that basically has, how I've used CircleCI, we would use the developer adoption and then do tops down sales and say, hey, look at all what your developers are doing, Salesforce, like maybe you should buy this across the whole company.
Standard operating procedure like PLG, kind of like Figma E, Dropbox E, less Dropbox, but like Figma E, Slack E, Zoom E, etc. Right?
Yeah, you get that like groundswell, and then you use the influence of that groundswell and the data that you get from that groundswell to then go, hey CTO, this is your average build time, with CircleCI. This is your average build time with Jenkins. Why are you going with a slower solution? Like,
Yeah, let's
the
go.
math becomes easy.
Yeah.
And realistically, I can borrow a lot of that same playbook at Census, because with Census, um, if the data teams are already looking at a tool like Census, they've already recognized the problem that,
Mm-hmm.
hey, we're not providing the most efficient solution to get this data. To get this data into business tools. We're spending too much time on this. I don't want to be a bottleneck anymore. I want my data engineers to be doing something else, especially in an economy that's, hey, your headcount was 10, now it's 3. What are
Yeah.
you going to do with those 3? Now, that's if they recognize it.
Yeah,
If
that's
they
if
don't, that's a different
yeah,
thing.
that's if like the sales starts with them, or they recognize that and are open to that. What about when it
Right.
starts on the other side, where like I can only I'm thinking through like the situation you would have with CircleCI, whereas probably what you wanted to understand was like how many people were using CircleCI in an account, right? Like maybe
Mm-hmm.
maybe you guys were instantiating Salesforce contact objects or not, for kind of like user accounts at CircleCI. And then of course
Yeah.
you want to look across that usage. And I'm sure you were just like banging your head against the wall. And that's why like you understood why Census would be so powerful
Right.
in a situation like that. Cool, but like you're the one who has the business plan, and you turn around to the data team and they're like, yeah, but like just like go look in Tableau here, like here's a report, and just like put them side by side on your monitor.
Right. And then I think that's where with Census, okay, you get that answer, then you're ultimately having that pain live with the business leader. That could be, usually it's CMO, could be CRO, could be other folks. Um, they're then saying, hey, this really isn't an operable solution for me. And it's not an operable solution for my organization. And that's where like I really like how we've leaned into the revenue operations and marketing operations roles at companies.
Yeah,
They're
kind of like
so
glue
important now.
between like
They are
two.
glue. Yeah,
Yeah.
and realistically, when that individual can really be empowered to start to say like, I am an advocate for both, they can then make the most efficient decision. What I think is the challenge is they're ultimately also tasked with reducing budget, and reducing expenditure, and that's where the one push on them is tough, and that's why you do have to win that business user also. So like if the business user is not serviced by the technical team, they have to really understand the value. So you can't just be like, hey, you want to solve this, right? They'll be like, sure. You
Hmm.
have to say, how important is it for you to solve
Yeah.
this? How vital is it going to be to your business? How much is this going to change? And then you go into the conversation with the operations team. They go, okay, we understand where the data team is. We understand where the revenue team is or the marketing team is. And now we can use that to justify a price point that's a little bit higher.
Yeah. So I don't know if you guys does Census have a like a POC pilot model at all, or got it.
And
So
that's
how
my
does that
point about not ignoring the developer. You can sign up for a free version of Census.
right? But I think the thing that's interesting there is my perception would be anytime you're relying on somebody to have empathy for somebody else in an organization, it's always like a pretty tough situation versus the person who's like has empathy for their own pain, right?
Yes.
And so you could totally imagine a situation wherein um, some sales leader or marketing leader would say like, hey, I'd love to have I don't know, like I'd love to have records, like lead records or contact records, upserted to, my Salesforce instance for all signups for, for kind of trial accounts in our software, right?
Sure.
Pretty straightforward. They're like, hey, I really want this, and they stumble up like maybe some Census BDR ends up in their inbox, or they like they follow me on Twitter, and I'm like tweeting about how much I love Census when I'm administering it on the weekend or something like that, and and they're like they go and they look and they're like, whoa, I really want this, or like I want to like play around with this, they get engaged with a census seller in some sort of capacity, and at that point, they're like, cool, what do I have to do in order to get this live? Like, I'd love to just set it up. And it's like, well, so what we need to do is like be able to whitelist this from Snowflake or Redshift, and you need your your VPE or like your data team to do that.
Right.
And like, obviously, like we don't want to lose momentum right there. What is the mechanism? And like, I think this is not just the census thing. This is something that happens with a lot of organizations that have two-legged sales, where you have a business user who then has to come to an internal vendor and say like, hey, I want to test out this thing that's like not a threat to you and also like not going to be more work for you or whatever. Like, how do you guys facilitate that right now?
So if you were to go and sign up for a trial of Census right now, there's actually a kind of fake instance from a
Perfect.
source that you can connect to and actually see data and say, cool, I want to sync data into systems. So you actually have that ability to do it even without having the keys to your Snowflake. Or BigQuery or Redshift. Yeah. So we
I'm
provide
sure that was
because of that
a non-trivial engineering effort on you guys as far. I mean, this is why Amplitude created their Amplitude sandbox, and it was like and this was back in the day before there was Reprise and DemoStack and Novatic and all these these like demo automation kind of like Tor softwares, because where you have a situation where somebody can't get access to a data source that they need in order to like turn on the POC. You don't want to just be like, all right, like here, it's like slides and images, right?
Right.
And so it seems like Census invested in essentially a sandbox in that capacity. It's good. Good workaround.
And we're going to continue to invest in more and more features and functionality that are more kind of business user facing, so that they can get more and more out of Census without that engineer. The reality is that operations person, they should be they should have full keys, right? Like they might not have all access to Snowflake, but once you have models set up, you are able to do essentially everything else with Census. And so we are working also on taking away more and more of the SQL out of the equation in terms of how you have to use SQL. So, more and more than I don't have to know it in order to use Census successfully. But yeah, it's an interesting problem, but I also think it's a really cool thing because you talked about like empathy for someone else. The reality is it should be a pain. There's pain on each part of the journey. It's just who is ultimately winning the journey of being like, I'm pushing the pain onto someone else, right? Like the data team is either saying to the marketing leader, like, sorry, this is the best it's going to be. And the marketing leader is in pain, or the marketing leader is like banging down the data team's door for more. And the data team's like, shit, how can we do this? And so the pain lives somewhere.
Yeah. Or, I mean, I think it's probably it lives in both places. The question is like, where it's higher magnitude. And then also you just need to make sure that the messaging is there appropriately for each persona. Like literally I was doing this with our PMM earlier, where we were writing up a solutions page for Atrium. And so, with our sales managers, clients and sales leader clients, the pain point is like, I don't have the data and metrics I need in order to manage by metric, because I'm not great at Salesforce reporting. I'm not great at Looker. Like, let's be honest, like, it's okay. We're all friends here. Right. And like, moreover, and it's not because I have a dearth of like dashboards. In fact, I'm actually like drowning in them because like, God bless our sales ops team. They're just like pushing them on me, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, I actually can't even navigate them. And so like, there's pain there. And then like you flip around to the sales ops side, and it's like the pain there is the joke we talk about is unrefreshed dashboards. Mm-hmm. Right, like how many unrefreshed dashboards, and they go like this. They go, oh my god, right? And so it's just like, hey, like, can we do? We call it like the marriage counseling sale, where it's like, hey, we can make both people happy. What do you think? We'll make both. Like, you don't have to be a dashboard jockey anymore, right? No more unrefreshed dashboard. You happy managers, like they're out of your Slack, they're not up in your Jira, like blowing you up, and the managers, like, they don't feel, they feel like they're enabled, and they don't feel like they're dumb. So like everyone's happy, and like performance. And so I think it just requires good like product marketing and kind of like good persona comprehension there, and making sure that like sellers can kind of talk out of both sides of their mouth, which of course is always fun when you have, well, especially when you have like a party call, right? And then it's like live it's like live marriage counseling with like both of
Right.
them right there, and like you're having to like, it's like, well, I can't call you a pain in the ass in front of them the way that I normally would if you aren't here. So, I'm going to use my magic, sales words in order to like alleviate everybody. But I think
Yeah,
that's
it's
like a
also
way
thinking
way
about
to
who
do
you
that.
hire, right? Like if we were only going to target the technical buyer, I would probably focus on an account executive who is more with that type of background versus like,
Datadog
cool, I've got to do,
background.
yeah, I've got to go technical buyer and I've got to go business user buyer. Like, especially if I'm going to talk to a marketer. I mean, marketers are more and more technical these days, but like the reality is it is tough to teach a salesperson how to speak to everyone perfectly. And I think that that's where it comes back to like, I just focus on value proposition and then pain. And then each one, kind of the pain, you might manifest a little differently. Okay, you want the data in Salesforce versus Mixpanel versus Google Ads. But like, if you understand the end result, that's what I try to focus the team on today.
Yeah, and then you can like at least kind of like constrain it down and battle card it, more simplistically. What
Right.
what is the right way of like how do you scale sales for a very technical product? I mean, I think that this is something that you contended with quite a bit at CircleCI. Yes, obviously, like I mean, Census, I think you said you guys have like a dozen sellers or so you're like it's not super scaled yet, just yet. Um, but for people who are like listening to this who do have very technical products, and
Yeah.
most sellers do not come from a technical background. In fact, like the reason why they're in sales is because they're communicators and persuaders and relationship builders and what have you. So what is a good way of kind of scaling that up? I think you said at CircleCI you had like 80 sellers or so. It's like
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
nothing.
Around that. Yeah. So you said a word that I think does not get said enough, which is persuasion. And realistically, we typically hire salespeople, partially at least, for their ability to take someone from point A to point B when they might not have gotten point B otherwise. And being persuasive, you're typically most persuasive in a topic you know a lot about, right?
Mm,
And then if you are not an engineer talking about a product that is for an engineer, it is more challenging to be persuasive. So I think the first thing is like, if you get any pushback on coaching and enablement, this is how I presented it to my CFO. Like, this is my onboarding. This is my ramp. This is quota retirement for ramp. Now I'm going to take this number and I'm going to shift it over 2 columns to the left when we do effective onboarding. Now
mm,
look at how much our return on investment is. Look how much our costs are reduced. So for me, having more help on the enablement side and product training side, it really pays huge dividends. I've invested massively there. Obviously, you invest in the sales engineering organization. That's great too. But if you end up just growing that team so big, it's almost like, why don't you just have them sell the product? So you have to scale onboarding and enablement. And it was an easy argument when I was like, cool, I'm shifting the $300,000 number to the number where it was 100,000. The other component is I did interview for technical capacity. Like I would do a technical quiz for an AE interview. Um, and I wasn't looking for them to get 100%. I wasn't looking for them to blow it out of the water, especially if
mm,
I was hiring for a more junior sales role. But I was looking for, there's the foundations there, and there's some also delta from our first conversation to our second conversation in terms of how much you picked up and learned. Like,
mm.
I expected them to get some additional knowledge through the research. And then obviously you dig hard on curiosity. What types of questions are they asking? What are they talking about? If I have the rep that's just like, cool, what's the quota? How many people are hitting it? I'm like, all right, you're not really thinking about this as the technical opportunity that it is. So
Mhm.
changed in hiring, focused on enablement a lot. And then obviously if I can borrow from someone that's already taken some of those steps, then I will, right? Like
Mhm.
if they've already gone through some training, then great. The reality was though, like even if they came from a competitor, I
Yeah.
still had to do a good amount of training and enablement. But that's I think the biggest reason was hiring the right people and onboarding them well and measuring the shit out of it. Like we
What
measured effectiveness hard.
yeah, I think that's super critical in onboarding. And I do a master class on data-driven ramp because I think a lot of organizations just look at they just look at the lagging indicators, whether it's time to full productivity, or even, time to first deal, things like that. But there's so many more leading indicators that are present there. Like, you want the leading indicator to that first deal. So, not just, and if you're measuring op build, right, like the ramp of op build and kind of pipe build there, that's great, but that's kind of insufficient, because obviously what you would want to understand is like, okay, well, like that's this leading indicator, and then there's like wins happen over here. What's in the middle, right? And that'll
Right.
probably be like, how many stage threes are we getting to, or what have you. And then also making sure that your reps are like, you could have all of these different things in isolation, can leave blind spots. So for instance, you could have a bunch of, your op build could be good, your pipe build could be good, but like, your customer facing meeting volume might be poor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or your customer facing meeting volume might be good, but none of those ops are progressing to, POC
Right.
or like stage 3 or what have you. And so just, like having this telemetry in place, especially in ramp, because, when you have, like a longer sales cycle, it's going to be 6 months, 9 months until somebody's getting to the point where they're at full productivity. And so just kind
Yeah.
of like crossing your fingers and hoping in month 3, like, yeah, they sound good on the phone. It's kind of insufficient there.
Yeah.
Uh, um,
Agreed.
one thing, I wanted to ask about is, because obviously CircleCI had a very uh, bottom up motion there. Um, like, in what environments are like top down sales like not very effective? Would you say?
Yeah. I mean, the tough part about like why CircleCI was maybe not the best place to be tops down was just
Hmm.
the reality was their developers have had an extraordinary amount of power at software companies for obvious reasons, right? There's too few of them, and too many of them are maybe like underqualified for certain roles
Hmm.
because there's this dearth. It's like, okay, we need to hire people that aren't quite there yet. So really, really good software engineers have been um, as big of decision makers as the CTO at times. And
Yeah.
so if they aren't involved, then you just don't get a groundswell of adoption. And like GitHub did they did this in spades where they like really got the community first. They went and did that. And then it was like, okay, well, everyone's already on GitHub. It made the choice easy because there
Hmm.
was no friction. Like, with salespeople, for example, if I was to say, hey, we're going to move to a different sales engagement platform tomorrow, it'd be okay if they all
Yeah.
already liked it. But if it was something that they were like, I've never used this before, I haven't experienced this before, there'd be resistance. Would
Mm.
they probably eventually use it? Sure. The reality is the developers have had substantially more autonomy than salespeople, and so they've been
Yeah.
like, "Cool, I'm just not going to use it." And
Yeah.
so it's hard for that to have it happen. Now, for a solution that's in cybersecurity or something to that effect, I think that the conversation has been a little bit different because it doesn't affect their day-to-day jobs as much. But when it's
Mhm.
such a user-focused tool, that's where I found that the tops down motion without any bottoms up groundswell was a lot tougher at CircleCI. One of the things I
Mhm.
would say though is the motion changed on market. So like San
Mhm.
Francisco, I could sell to a software engineer and they could buy a $300,000 contract almost without sign off from exec. Like
Mhm.
um, in
But
England,
in Dallas or something, yeah.
well, yeah, I mean, and even to take the more extreme example, like the UK or France, their their willingness to kind of put themselves out there as an IC, not there. It's a lot more hierarchical from a decision making
Yeah.
standpoint. So it just didn't work. So we had to be a little bit more tops down in those markets, and you have to hire reps accordingly.
I think that's a really, yeah, because it's almost like what you're describing is the sales motions, the sales motion is impacted by like labor market power dynamics, right?
Yeah, one hundred
Where
percent.
if you've got like really scarce labor resources that have a hair in their nose about A, B, or C, right?
Right.
Then then, being like, hey, look, guys, like, just use Jenkins. They'll be like, maybe I'm actually just gonna leave.
Right.
And then the VP is like, oh man, right?
Yeah.
Which is like kind of a hilarious like sentence to say, but I think, like, it is what it is, right? It's like realistic. I think
Yeah.
that yeah, I think understanding, this is almost like a sales strategy thing. I think we've found this pretty substantially here at Atrium as well, where like understanding the contours of your market kind of will reveal to you what motion can work and what can't. Like the metaphor I like to use for it is like the path through the forest.
Hmm.
Um, and in this case, so like let's use like CDPs as an example, right?
Sure.
Like, obviously Segment kind of ran the table there. Um,
Hmm.
but the funny thing was is like Segment started out as a essentially like a tag manager, right?
Hmm.
And I remember actually you work with some former Segment people over there at Census.
Yeah.
Malika is really awesome. Early on, Segment gave away so much utility, and essentially just like kind of papered the market, right, or flooded the market. So everyone, like all developers, were like, yeah, tag management, right? Like, like sending events to various sources, like, yeah, you use Segment for that, right? And now
Yep.
the reason why they were able to do that is because it was free, and like their docs were good and all that sort of stuff. But I remember talking with their sales organization early on. They're like, yeah, the biggest kind of like our biggest source of competition is the free version, right? Whereas of course, mParticle was coming down from tops down because they actually had
Right.
a marketing background. Like all the founders of mParticle came out of what I like to call creepy Martech. And so they were very familiar with the notion, like, cataloging millions and billions of events in order to like do things with it.
Right.
And like the pain points associated with, like, if you're the CMO at Pepsi or like Anheuser-Busch or fill in the blank, like you have these pain points. So like showing up there and going tops down, but then you collide with like engineering's like, oh yeah, we should just use Segment for that,
Well,
right?
that's
And
why
so
I actually loved Segment. Like, so I was one of the creepy Martech people. So when I was at
did
Tune,
Turn
we
do
were
CDP?
to
Or
so
sorry, not
Tune.
Turn. Tune, was Tune a
Yeah,
CDP? I
I mean
can't remember.
there was Tune, Tune
There's
FM.
Turn, the Tune, Turn,
Exactly.
Branch, this, that.
So Branch actually ended up acquiring this piece of the business from Tune, but Tune was the
Oh, I remember
first
that.
mobile ad attribution platform. So like when you got that ad for that app on Facebook and clicked to install it, we were probably the ones to measure it. And so we were selling, like I led brand sales there, and we were selling to like, Amazon or Starbucks or whoever that's doing these ads. So I was selling tops down CMOs. Like, this is something that is fundamental to your strategy, having a mobile app, because this is back when it was like newer to have a mobile app and everyone wanted one, right? Like Domino's has a mobile app. And then it was like, shit, well, there's this Segment thing that's really cool because it takes all the pressure off the developer pushback that I get, because the developers don't want to integrate another SDK. So Segment, if they already have Segment, they can just work with us because they can start sending us API calls. And at that time, I was like, this is cool for me. But what I didn't really think about was like, well, shit, now Segment's in all of these mobile apps, and they can start building all these tools for marketers, and they can start adding a lot of value that way. Um, and mParticle, I know those folks really well, and like the reality was, it was driven by this pain that was coming from marketers, and that's
Yeah.
the interesting thing now is the power dynamic has shifted. The power dynamic
Mhm.
has shifted because all of a sudden it was like, no, I'm not going to integrate another SDK for you, marketer. I'm going to use Segment, and now I'm going to start making decisions about upstream. And I kind of saw that power dynamic shift, and I think we all saw that in Silicon Valley too, when it was like, hey, the daily active user number, maybe that's not a way to measure the effectiveness of a company anymore. After we saw Twitter go public and all that kind of fun stuff, but
Yeah, I think the
it's an
takeaway here
interesting
is that
time.
like understanding like who has the power in like in the go to like sorry in the purchase workflow, um, and then just making sure that you have a compelling value proposition for them,
Yeah, and if you can give
as
them
well.
power, even better, right? Like if you can really put power in their hands, and that's why I think that for us, it's really about breaking down the barriers for anyone to be able to use data, right? Like if the marketer can easily have access to the data that they need in the systems that they need it to, what can that marketer do? They can do considerably more, and they're not going to be, in a bottleneck situation.
Yeah. What so kind of speaking of, I think another thing that ends up being that you have to contend with is the path through the forest can change contingent on, I think as you were talking about earlier, it can change depending on the geography, right? Like, you thought the path through the forest was lit by pissed off software engineers for CircleCI until you got to London, and then all of a sudden you were like, actually no, I guess we have to like start with the CIO or
Mm-hmm.
whoever. Like this is a more traditional like top down sale, but then that can also change in
Yeah,
a as like economic environment. So like I'll give you an
end of day.
example. One of the Yeah, exactly, right. So like one thing that's kind of fascinating, like use Atrium as an example. We put a bunch of engineering resources into making it such that like you can just turn on Atrium in like 2 minutes, right? So like it's not PLG, but it's like sales assisted. So we actually have like lots of organizations where, some sales manager, some SDR manager takes a disco call and they just are like, yeah, I want to turn this on. Like, I have no idea. Like, I have no scorecarding for my reps. Like, let's go. Cool. All right, share your screen here. Like, click here. Um, and then of course, like we don't do that just for funsies. We do that in order to like catalyze a transaction. And so making sure that those don't dead end is an important thing. Now, historically, maybe in like more like looser budgetary times, you might have a situation where somebody who is kind of like lower in the food chain can make a transaction decision. In the case of like Atrium, what you're talking about is like a multi-thousand-dollar transaction for a sales manager, because it's not like Notion or Zoom or like Slack or whatever, where it's a very kind of cheap per month thing. It's like a sales manager who's responsible for 8 reps or what have you, and it's kind of priced appropriately. That like worked. And then then you kind of start seeing things where it's like, hey, look, like any kind of purchase, like authentication has to come through, like has to be at VP level, or has to go up like one more level, so on and so forth. And it's things, so like the path through the forest may change kind of
Mm-hmm.
contingent on economic realities as well. What, like, how have you guys seen that change, you guys' sales motion? And I know that you joined Census kind of post like raised interest rate, or like post zero
Sure.
interest rate policy, kind of like vibe shift, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder like how that has impacted you guys' sales motion.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good question. I think everyone's kind of dealing with this. I'm seeing companies that just default anything over even like $5,000 or $10,000 is being approved by the CFO, like anything, and that
Yeah.
never would have been the case. Like 2019 developer tools, like no, they didn't care. It was like spend the money, grow faster, top line, and the reality for us has just been uh, that we need to be more proactive in our sales approach. Like we can't just have the sale come to us and expect it to close it in any kind of predictable time frame. Because if we're relying on the inbound, who is not the CFO, to drive the decision making process, we're really
Yeah.
going to be behind. And so it's essentially, as soon as we get to a point where we've established POC criteria, it's basic medpic stuff. It's going through procurement and competitor conversation and establishing that process. And it's getting it on the radar of those folks a lot earlier so that they understand the business value. So it's not, hey, by the way, I'm coming to you for $50,000 or $100,000 approval. And then they're like, what the hell? Now I have to go back and reevaluate it. Now I want your boss's boss to go look at the solution.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just means that we've had to be a lot more proactive. And I think early stage startup, like you have tons of inbound, you don't have a lot of salespeople. It's tough to do that because you're like, well, I'm good, right? When you grow the sales
They're gonna
organization, I
buy.
think, right, like they're gonna buy, like it's fine. If they don't buy, someone else will buy. And it's like, no, you want everyone to buy, or everyone that's your ICP. and that's ultimately changing, obviously, with me being here, and then also just growing the team. Growing the team is like, cool, we can be a little bit more thoughtful about our overall sales approach and make sure we do that proactive communication to the financial buyer.
Yeah, it's funny. Like this is literally something that we're dealing with. So we use we have some like sales playbook software that we use for kind of like guided selling for our reps. We use Accord. And one of the things that we've done is in a situation where you drive more, you drive that POC or what have you. It's like constraining the time and calories that an AE will potentially spend on an op before they insist on bringing in power, essentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so a good example of that would be, whereas previously what we might have done is like kind of navigate, like do a little bit of like a guerrilla groundswell within an organization, be like, hey, like let's bring in another sales manager, let's bring in, what have you. It's like very quickly kind of like jump up and say, like to the VP level or what have you, and say like, hey, like is like based on our discovery conversations with these folks right here, seems like this is like a pretty high priority for you guys. Like if it's not, like maybe you should, if it's not, if it is a high priority, like great, let's align and like let's run through the finish line with each other.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not, maybe you should like consider that like we've discovered something within your organization that like is worthy of prioritizing. But
Mm-hmm.
if you're gonna say like, hey, cool, like these guys may be whining about the fact that they don't, they don't have the data they need to manage by metric, but like too bad, right? Like that's not going to be a priority for us for the next 6 months. Way better to put like a bullet in the head of that deal early
Sure.
on and like not piss away a bunch of AE time.
Right.
Because then what you want to do is like, spend good time with good opportunities instead. And so I think that that's something that we've done, whereas previously we might have let our sellers be a little bit more like speculative or like promiscuous within their ops. Now it's kind of like, all right, cool. Like, do we have initial championship from someone, or even like initial like sponsorship from someone? They may not actually be like a medpic definition of championship, where
Right.
they'll advocate to get us access to the economic buyer or what have you. But instead, like do you have your lead blocker, your fullback? If you think you do, compel them to show you
Right.
by by facilitating a meeting between you and their, it's essentially just like a litmus test, right?
Right.
And then we get like, okay, in or out, right? And if it's out,
Mm-hmm.
that's okay, it's out, right? Like let's do a good shot on goal there, like maybe get to the second or the third no, but at that point, like let's move on. Versus
Mm-hmm.
just kind of like continuing to have like a lot of meetings with people who are never going to be able to like drive the ball across the line.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a champion, I think one of the things that's challenging with the technical buyer is sometimes they are not they're not the fullback. Like they, at the end of the day, will
Yeah,
be like,
they're
cool,
like
this is a
afraid
really
to be
good
the fullback.
solution. Yeah, but they don't want to be the fullback. They don't want to take on. We could go for a long time on sports analogies. So they don't want to
Yeah.
ultimately be the person that has to go up in front of the organization and vouch for it. And so ultimately, what I found is like the best way to then kind of combine that tops down and make sure you do get that economic buyer is like if you can use a VC or exec referral into a tops down conversation and just say like, hey, we wanted to put this on your radar. We're working with your team. No
Me
action
in the middle.
necessary, but like if you want to be on the next call, this is when we're having it. Like we are engaging, and it's even before it's like, hey, we're at this point where it's blocked. It's even earlier, and it's like, no, this is great. Keep working with that team. That's typically the response we'd get. Like, continue to go with that team. They're involved. I'll be kind of aware, and maybe they start asking you some questions, and they do get involved, or they say
Yeah,
like,
it's like executive multi-threading.
yeah,
It's executive multi-threading in the needs analysis
mm-hmm.
stage, right?
It's
Which I
early,
think a
but
lot
no
of
one does
times,
that.
well, because I think people are afraid. They're like, don't tell dad, don't tell dad. right? Like he'll just fuck it up. And I think that people are afraid of that versus it's almost kind of like you want to do that earlier on. Because like, the ideal situation is, oh great, right? Like that's something that's been top of mind for me. I'm glad that they're looking into that. I would like to join, or like, oh yeah, keep me apprised of what's happening. Um, the the downside situation there is when someone says like, yeah, like no, like NFW, like no way, this is not happening. Like, but I think the interesting thing there is like you have to consider when you tell yourself the story, can we get enough of a groundswell to surmount that?
Yeah.
Right? Like, maybe that was something that you could potentially do in the past, but maybe you're just telling yourself a pleasant lie. And instead you're just going to piss away a bunch of time before you get to that conversation where the same answer that could have been had 4 weeks earlier around like NFW is still NFW. It's just 4 weeks later, and you've had like 3 more meetings.
And that I think is power dynamic, right? Like I know people that try to sell to BDRs because BDRs reply, and then it's like, cool, you've got 10 BDRs that like this, and it's like, okay, and right, but like when it was 10 engineers, that was a little bit different. That conversation was a little bit different. It was like, oh shit, this is my whole team. They already like it. They're already using it, and it's making them more productive. Shit, I'll probably buy that. Like, I'm good. I don't want to stand in the way of my engineers because they'll probably just quit and get paid 50% more at another company. Like, that was, it was, and I think that, we've talked about the power dynamics changing. Like, I think that the safest way is never assume that the folks you do have kind of complete power and influence, but then use them if you can and help them be that agent of change. And if they aren't kind of able to or willing to, or at that point where they can be that agent of change, like go have that executive top down so where you can combine it. I think that's the safest way to do a deal. Now, takes time, takes a lot of work. Is it feasible in every SMB deal? That's where you maybe will have more of a challenge, but I think today it's the way that you can make sure we're not kind of, hey, we don't have any budget for this conversation.
Yeah, and like meeting 8. Right.
Yeah,
I think that's something that a lot of sales motions that previously had worked are not working anymore because of like because those dynamics have changed. Changing gears a little bit here. I think one of the things that you've kind of talked about is like talent development and kind of like hiring and so on and so forth. Specifically, we were talking about that as relates to technical sales people and what have you. What about like with management, right? There's like, what's a great way for managers, so like sellers who want to be on the management track, or like managers who want to be on the leadership track, to kind of demonstrate like potential talent for management and kind of leadership. Like, what do you look for there? What do you encourage your staff to do, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I don't know if you've experienced this, but I've certainly experienced that you kind of do the job that you want before you actually
Always
get paid for doing that job, right? And so
they do it on spec.
Yeah, if I'm an IC seller and I want to progress into a management track, I can't drop my IC responsibilities, right? I have to continue to exceed quota there, et cetera. And part of that is what can qualify for you for a manager, but often like a top IC is not a good candidate for a manager, and they're just a great IC. And then what I typically see is like they should think about how they can ultimately expand their impact. And so that's what kind of light bulb went off for me, was like, hey, I can be really effective as an individual selling, but if I'm ultimately investing more of my time into making 4 people effective at selling, then I'm 4xing my impact. Maybe it's not each one is the same as I was as an IC, but they're some level of improved, and that's more helpful. And so I think as an IC, if I'm an IC thinking about how I get into management track, whether it's in enablement, IC, like AE operations, etc. Um, it's starting to think about how I can help the organization in a bigger way, and starting to take those initiatives on beyond what you're doing today. I think that if I'm already in a management position and I want to progress more into leadership, the reality is you have to start zooming out and thinking about strategy and how you can actually change strategy rather than just improve the way that you're executing strategy today. That's what I see as the difference between, someone that's a solid manager and someone that's maybe like a director or VP, is that they will look at a situation and go, as a manager, I did this effectively from someone else's strategy. And then as a leader, I'm going, how can we alter the strategy to be more effective even in an even bigger way? And realistically, there's not like this, do this, then that. I think it's doing both. But I know for me, when I was kind of progressing into leadership, that was a bigger shift, was thinking not just about how we do what we're doing today better, but thinking about what the end result is and what the better way is to get there.
I was talking with one of our sales managers about this the other day. I think another thing that kind of differentiates leadership from, and by leadership, what I mean is like second level leadership, maybe where you have like multiple managers going into you, is the funny thing about sales, and I think this actually like aligns, like it makes it such a lot of salespeople who are maybe a little bit disorganized, like can kind of be okay. At least in a mid-market or like a commercial motion, is because like you have a portfolio of deals that you're contending with. And like if you make a boo-boo with one of them or a couple of them or whatever, and like a close loss, right? Like that's why we have a portfolio. Maybe it'll come back around again or what have you. Whereas the thing that's kind of different as a sales leader is like you only have one sales motion, if you will. And like you really have to honey badger that and make sure that people are doing a good job of complying with it, because because like it's not like there's like multiple sales motions, like there's just like this one right here. And so like you're innovating that or like systematizing that, and if you leave things kind of short, which I think is like, if you think about what makes it a very effective seller, is like, they might be persuasive, they might be like, high bias to action, they're persistent, all those sort of things that might get them into being like they're a good like political creature, right? Like they're able to like read the tea leaves and navigate, the relationships and what have you. You could probably be a pretty successful manager, at least like a 1.0 manager, then helping your reps with that, right? And like this is your prototypical example of like your sales manager who's like very deal focused, as opposed to like my buddy Corey Bray talks about this, like rather than coaching the play, you coach the player, right? But in like those very deal centric managers, they'll coach the plays, because they'll be sitting there and kind of be like, okay, in this situation do this, in this situation do this, in this situation do this. But then when you get up a level and you've got like 3 or 4 managers, you really just have to be like the systems person, and like really like you're making documentation, you're like your sister, like, hey, like this is the agenda that everybody uses in their own respective team meetings, and I made a Google document on it in order to systematize it, and by the way, it hyperlinks to all of these like metrical resources here, because I'm not going to allow people to try to like make it up as they go. And that's a very different behavior than being like a deal coach, if you will. And I think that's where a lot of people kind of like fall off, because a lot of a lot of sellers really enjoy selling because it's like the thrill of the chase and like the victory and all those sort of things. Whereas like, being an effective sales leader is like a lot of minutia and like paperwork and kind of like process and what have you. Did you always have a bent for that? I was gonna say, did you have a bent for that, or did you have to have like a holy shit moment where it's like, hey man, like I gotta get tight on these boring things?
So when I first was in manager, I was totally the coaching the play, right? And I was even more, I would say I'm I'm skating on the ice, and then I'm probably like passing
Pass it to
it to
me.
you when it's almost in the goal, right? Like
Yeah.
that was how I started because I was a great IC and I knew how to do enablement and I knew how to do training on product, but I wasn't like, hey, this is how I enable a person. Um, and the kind of first thing that I learned was like, hey, shit, I hired a person and they weren't successful. And I thought that they were going to be great. And it was like, why weren't they great? Well, I didn't really actually invest in them personally. I just invested in the deal and we closed some deals. But did we do that in an actually inefficient way? Because we just had two people spending the time on it. That was the
Yeah,
light bulb
exactly.
moment for me. And then
Yeah.
it was, so that was kind of step one into becoming maybe like, maybe a 2.0, maybe a 1.5. When I got to Circle, I reported into the CRO, and she was amazing at all of the minutia. She was the best at Excel at the company. So
Mhm.
she was one of those people that's like, you better not use your mouse. Um,
Mm.
and so learning from her, like a lot of that skill set was incredibly valuable for me. But one of the really interesting things that I went through was, going from having that bigger team and then joining a Series A where I was back on the front line selling again. Like I literally
Right.
went from like I've got to do that to then I've got to sell. And I think that like one of the things that I regret at Circle was not staying uh, was not continuing to go back down to the weeds every once in a while. Like if you stay
Yeah.
too high, I think that
Yeah.
you'll start to be like, cool, this is the strategy and we're going to do this. And then you could be actually missing something fundamental that's obvious to your inbound BDR. And I would try to spend time with inbound BDRs to be like, why is this the case? And it was funny how frequently, like, just doing that would actually give me a shit ton of ideas.
Yeah.
Um,
Reveal like a constraint. Yeah.
right.
This is something I talk about is like the Toyota lean manufacturing and like being on the assembly line. Like one of the things that, like, or sorry, not being on it, but like being willing to go down from the control booth to go to the assembly line in order to understand, like, this is weird. Like this one assembly line right here, like continues to have like a very high defect rate, like rather than trying to like drive a bunch of hypotheses by like cutting the data a bunch of different ways. It's like, why don't we just walk down there, right? And
Yeah.
I think like it'll be a lot quicker to
I,
do that.
yeah. I think that for anyone that's a sales leader or operations leader listening to it, if you don't understand Toyota production system, like go read the Wikipedia page at least. That's incredibly valuable stuff. Like I think a lot of the way that software engineering practices are today are actually derived from Toyota production system. And realistically, like I think there's a lot to be gained from that. I think it's a great example.
Yeah, one of the things I love to do is have people read The Goal. It's like one of my favorite books. It's a novelization of Toyota lean manufacturing, and when I tell people sometimes jokingly that Atrium is a combination of two books. It's The Goal, which is kind of like systems instrumentation, like manufacturing kind of optimization book, and then and Bill Walsh's The Score Takes Care of Itself, which is all about like focusing on strong, like a high quantity of high quality actions will then lead to good outcomes, but unfortunately you can't like directly impact good outcomes.
Right.
It's like you can only impact these things in front of you. And so if you merge those, this is why at Atrium we say that sales success is all about a high quantity of high quality selling behavior. And so if you want to understand whether or not a high quantity of high quality selling behavior is happening, you have to instrument it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then moreover, the kind of the extension of that is, and then if it's not right, like if somebody's having a bookings issue or like there's a defect, like if that instrumentation shows you that something is off there, like this person's conversion rate on XYZ is problematic, that's where we go and like listen to their calls, right? Like we're
Right.
not listening to everyone's calls, like kind of like whack-a-mole, because like who's got
Right.
time for that, right? It's kind of
Yeah.
like the like two reps on a deal sort of thing. In this case, like nobody even like listening to calls at like 2x, it's like bananas. Versus saying like, hey, this person's got a problem out of like discovery, or this person's got a pipeline hygiene problem, or this person has an activity problem. Let's then go debug. Let's go down to the line and figure out why this person has a customer facing meeting problem, or like let's go down to the line and understand why this person has an untouched opportunities problem.
Right. And you
Cool.
have to get the science right in order to actually focus on the art. And that's for me, like, you have to establish that baseline. So totally agree.
Yeah, this is why we kind of like talk about sales nerds and what have you. Like the younger sales leaders, like they kind of get it. They're folks. I can't remember if you had a whoop on your wrist or not. Like folks who are like, the instrumentation kind of like stuff is more native to the folks who kind of came up in the like were children of the 90s, et cetera, et cetera. Folks who have kind of been around a little bit longer, starting to get it more, which is great, and we're starting to see that in our customer base. But it definitely is like very much table stakes. Well, Chris, we're up on time here. This was super fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time to hang
Yeah, I
out.
appreciate being here.
Yeah, if you come out and visit the Census folks here in San Francisco, please do drop a line so we can we can go to Louis downstairs, or like Yangtze or whatever, or like make Boris take us out. But
Yeah,
otherwise, have
sounds
a good
good.
rest of your week. Okay.
Thanks, Pete. See you soon.
Okay. Bye.